G'day guys, how are we going? Now this week's question for Batesy's Q&A comes from Jeremy. Now Jeremy's asked, he's got front and rear lockers, actually in a patrol like mine, good bloke that Jeremy. But look, he wants to know when to use his front and rear lockers when out on the tracks, and specifically for the high country, to make his time out there safer and easier. Well, these are great questions, mate. So we'll start down the rear at the rear locker first, because that's the one that I use certainly the most. So we'll get in the back and we'll talk about the rear one first. So at the rear axle here that's got the rear locker in it, I'll talk about why I engage pretty much the rear locker all the time. So from the time I engage full drive inside the patrol, well, I generally hit the button and that'll engage the rear locker as well. And the reason why I do that, because when you install a rear locker into the diff housing, particularly in the patrol, out comes that rear LSD center, which is in these, and that's a great setup on its own. But when you put a rear locker in, well, it's certainly another different ball game altogether. And the reason why I engage it all the time is because if you're out full driving and you haven't got this rear locker in, it just very quickly becomes a single pegger. So if one of these tyres come off the ground, you're not going to have any traction at all in the back end here. So that is the reason why I engage that rear diff pretty much from the time I engage full drive inside. But the only time, or one of the few times where I do disengage the rear, if you're going around tight corners on a track, whether it be up a hill, run a tight switchback, I'll generally disengage that rear locker just to help it get around that corner a lot easier, rather than having the two wheels locked in, and you'll find it so much harder to get around the corner with that rear locker in. So in those times, that is certainly the time when I'll hit the button again, disengage that rear, get around the corner, and then I'll re-engage it around the other side. So there's a couple of reasons why I use that rear locker a fair bit, and for me it seems to work a treat. We'll go up the front, we'll have a chat about the front locker, because there's a fair bit goes on with that one. So let's have a chat about that one. Okay, so just talking about the front axle here that's got the front locker in. Now, I don't drive on this all the time, so I don't drive with it locked all the time. The only times when I will engage the front is if I'm looking up the track and I can see, some big rock steps and rocky situation going on, or some really deep, ruts. That's a time when I'll engage that front locker, work my way up to that situation nice and slowly, and generally walk my way through nice and early, particularly if you've got front and rear lockers engaged. It's a good way of walking your way through those situations without causing too much trouble to your vehicle. But there's a couple of things you've got to take into account, particularly in big rocky step country like that, and you got the front locker in. If you go through with too much momentum and you start bouncing tyres off the ground, when that tyre comes back down again and everything's all locked up, there's a huge amount of stress goes through your drivetrain. So you've got to be very, very conscious and careful that when those tyres come back down again, that you don't go busting CVs and axles and all sorts of stuff. So it's a really good idea, just take your time, get through the situation, and then generally you have no problem at all. But the other thing you've got to take into account, particularly when the front's locked in, if you're going through those big rocky sections and again you start bouncing tyres off the ground, when those tyres come back down, they can kick you sideways at the front of you very, very easily, and you've got to be super conscious of that, because it takes you by surprise when you're not used to these sort of things going on. So it's all about, that's the beauty with having front and rear lockers. It allows you to get to a situation, take your time, crawl your way through it, get over the other side of the situation, and then maybe take your front locker out and carry on up the track. But the other thing too, make sure you engage that front hub. Make sure they're locked in when you go any sort of full driving. Make sure they're locked in, and particularly before you go using any front lockers, you want it all tied up, all nice and tight. And otherwise, if you don't have that locked in, well, you've got a fair chance of breaking hubs and CVs and all sorts of stuff. So lock that hub in every single time. And the other time too, where I will disengage, particularly the front locker, like I said with the back one, if I'm going around tight corners or tight switchbacks, disengage that front locker. That'll help you to get around, because when that's engaged, your steering gets all tight and you don't have a great deal of steering, not as much as you do when it's not engaged. So just to keep an eye on that sort of situation too, any tight corners, just disengage that front locker, get round the corner, and then re-engage it if you need it in. So there you go, mate. I hope those questions have helped you out with front and rear lockers in your patrol, but keep those questions rolling in, and fair chance, I'll see you guys out in the bush someday.